It's already getting dangerous. Got a lot of questions and comments on the free speech debate, the proposed changes to the Anti-Discrimination Act and the Attorney-General's claim that people have a right to be bigots. Here are two videos on the subject.
Tim Wilson's comments to The Age this weekend, calling it bizarre that racial terms may be used freely within communities of colour, but not by white people, and claiming free use of the N-word would restore equality, revealed a breathtaking lack of basic comprehension, that words may carry different meaning depending on the speaker, akin to not understanding that knives can both stab and butter bread.
Mr. Wilson, if the government changes 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act, will the Human Rights Commission change its educational message? Bigotry is acceptable in Australia. You can offend, insult, humiliate anyone you like as long as you do not intimidate or vilify. Will this not create a new generation of bigots?
Tim Wilson, let's start with you.
Sure. Well, firstly, there's a factual inaccuracy in that story, which is that I never said that it was the case that people should be able to use those terms. What happened was I was explaining to a journalist that there's a difference between social convention and law, and making the very clear case that we should have equality before the law, and that is very different from social convention. Social convention is when somebody makes an error and people apologise because they recognise the offence. A law is when you limit what people can say. And when you talk about free speech...
Well, can I just interrupt you there? Did you tell him it's bizarre that members of the community can use racially loaded language against each other, but that outsiders can't use it? Because that's where this has come from.
Well, and where it's come from is talking specifically about one particular legal case and talking about how it established a principle where the assessment about whether people are found to be infringement of the law is based on the attitudes of that particular community, which creates inequality before the law. And just to show you how non-controversial this proposition is, even the advocates for not changing parts of the Racial Discrimination Act on Sky News' Australian Agenda yesterday recognised that the proposal of, if you want to get wonky about it, subsection 3 of the proposal, that had their support with minor changes because they also agreed with the proposition that it was not fair to have inequality before the law. But when we're talking about free speech, we should always come from a basis in which you have a blank canvas and everything is legal until it is made illegal. Now, when it comes into conflict with other rights, it's entirely reasonable to say that there are limits. So a classic example is defamation because it's related to people's future earning capacity and their property, etc. Equally, there are other reasons around national security. But my deference will always be to free speech because in the end it is the best medicine to a lot of the problems that we have in society, because there's a somewhat, I have to say, naive assumption around the topic of the Racial Discrimination Act, which is that racism can purely be solved by law. We know that is not the case. We also have to inject cultural norms and standards and drive them through culture and society to improve the issues that we're talking about. And that happens through things like social conventions and others.
OK, to get to the point of what the Attorney-General said, do you believe people have a right to bigotry?
Well, I actually think the comment highlights so many of the problems around discussion of human rights today. Because people say people have a right to this, they have a right to that. What people have a right to is a freedom of thought, and it's an absolute right, because no government can tell you what to think. But you also have a right to freedom of expression. And as I've said, the deference should be towards freer speech, and if there is legitimate justification, there can be margins of the error, but it's a natural right that we all enjoy, and it must be preserved and protected.
So bigotry is not one of the rights?
Well, you do not have a right to that. You have a right to freedom of thought and a right to freedom of expression. But obviously that includes both the most wonderful thoughts that people and most wonderful speech people can have, and sometimes the worst things people can think and the worst things people can say.
I'm just going to bring in, we've got another questioner up the back, and then I'm going to bring in the other panellists. Go ahead, it's Peter Connell.
Yes, my question is in support of free speech being the best medicine for the bigotry disease. How can the issue be discussed if a person's words for or against the issue are forbidden to be used?
Lucy.
Well, first, let me begin with the Attorney General's comment, because this is not a law professor. This is a public official who, as I agree with Mona, he should be setting social norms. This is a man who should not be running around saying, you have a right to be a bigot. He should be saying, bigotry is wrong. That's what public officials should do. So I start there.
Yeah.
Now, I think something we should all be able to agree on is that regardless of what you feel about sort of giving offense to somebody, there's certain things that are clearly wrong. Discrimination, intimidation, those kinds of clear physical wrongs.
Incidentally, have you looked at the way this Act is being, or proposed to be, rewritten? Because it puts in the word vilify.
Yeah. But see, what I wanted to address, Tony, is that
but it uses the very specific definition for the word vilify, that is to intimidate someone.
Precisely. But what concerns me is that the intimidation
Incites
clause...
to violence, I think.
There's an exception to the intimidation clause. You can intimidate somebody, cause them to fear violence if you're engaged in a public discussion. Now, that is a huge loophole that is taking a big step backwards, because we should all be able to agree that that kind of intimidation is just flat wrong. That should never happen, regardless if it's a public discussion or whatever. So in those two respects, I completely disagree with where the government is going. The place where I would urge caution is I am very reluctant to get into the business of making it illegal to give offense to somebody. I understand where that's coming from, because it's coming from the desire to protect the vulnerable. But I've seen how laws like that are misused around the world. And if you're an Ahmadiyya in Indonesia, if you're a Christian in Pakistan, if you're a gay in Uganda, there are lots of things you can do and say that give offense to the majority. And believe me, these laws tend to be used by the majority against the vulnerable minority. So I think we just have to tread cautiously if we're going to start legislating the idea of offense, because offense is very subjective, and the offense that tends to govern is the offense of the powerful, not the weak.
Correct. I'll get back to Tim Wilson on this. I no doubt you'd agree with the last part of what you said there.
Oh, absolutely, and that's part of the problem. I mean, these laws, the way they're written at the moment, and people, I make no apology. My view is that philosophically the whole thing should be repealed, but I also realise there's genuine concern within the community about the issues around racial vilification. And, of course, I agree with you also, mate, that laws also play a part, also cultural norms and standards. But when you have a situation where offence or insult, which, when we're talking, particularly if we're talking about issues of race, is partly about cross-cultural communication, it's very easy to invoke. And, of course, you can actually have a situation where you end up using it against the weak and the powerless. Because free speech as an important birthright is so important for the weak and the powerless. The rich and the powerful can always get their views out. They can buy newspapers, they can buy TV stations, they can buy radio stations.
So why an amendment to protect Andrew Bolt?
Well, but it's not about protecting him, it's about the precedent that case established. If people actually go and look at the case law, it establishes a precedent, which is not actually, obviously it relates to him, but the precedent applies to everybody into the future. And that's part of the problem, which is why even the advocates you've
made a point there which is contestable, because the truth is, the thing that really caused him to come a cropper with a series of factual errors in his articles. He would have had a defence were it not for all those errors.
That's not true. So there is also issues around tone. And again, if we want to... I mean, I had this thing on Saturday morning where I did a radio interview exactly on this topic, where somebody was basically making the point that free speech should be limited to accurate speech. And in the process of them doing that, they made 4 errors. And I said, this demonstrates the problem clearly. The issue is not about changing to protect him. It's about the precedents established and how that impacts on everybody, not just them.
Tim, we have to move on to other subjects, but the Act is in draft form at the moment. But why, if you're going to use the word vilify in it, why not use the correct meaning of vilify, which in fact is to demean someone, to put them down, to defame them, in its Latin term, to make them worthless? Why not use that as a definition rather than incitement to violence, which is not what vilify means?
Well, I didn't draft it. No. I'm the Human Rights Commissioner.
You think it's badly drafted?
No, I think that...
You were talking about precision.
No, I agree.
Just now.
But I'm sorry, there's a proposal out there. People are entitled to have engage with a consultation and send their suggestions. And one of the suggestions I've heard already from the advocates for limiting the change is to change some sections of it and improve it. And so I think it's entirely reasonable.
Could you improve it by giving vilify its correct meaning?
Well, I'd have to get legal advice, and that's part of the challenge. I'm still waiting for my legal advice on what the proposal actually means from the Human Rights Commission.
All right, let's move on.